World War I, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, changed the ways wars would be fought forever. The Entente, dominated by France, Russia, and Great Britain, and the Central Powers, dominated by Germany and Austria-Hungary, tried to create new technology in order to outmatch the enemy. It caused the advancement of military technology such as equipment, aircraft, submarines, artillery, and of course, tanks. In this video, I will go over two tanks used in World War I, the British-made Mark IV and the German-made A7V. Both of these tanks were engaged in the first tank-on-tank battle in history called the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux. First, I will briefly go over the history of the tank design and then compare the two tanks using 6 categories. The categories we will look at are speed and maneuverability, firepower, armor, crew conditions, reliability, and production. Winston Churchill, who at the time was the administrator of the Royal Navy, saw the potential of mechanical weapons in battle. The Army needed a way to cross no man's land, cut through barbed wire, and cross enemy trenches. The armored tank design would also be used as a shield to protect advancing infantry. The British Navy and Army created ideas for what we know as a tank. The Army and Navy came together to form the Land Ships Commission and would work on the first designs for a tank. Some ideas they had were armored tractors, armored cars, and some other trench-crossing machines. Their first tank was named Little Willie, which was up and running by September 1915. It had caterpillar tracks, which worked very well, but the tank was too small to make its way over trenches, so a rhomboid shape was settled on for the shape of future models. The Mark I was the first tank used in action, and the Mark II and III were used as training vehicles and were similar to the Mark I. The Mark IV, the first mass-produced tank, was an improved version of the Mark I and made changes based on the experience gained on the front. Director of the Tank Supply Department, Albert Gerald Stern, wanted a more powerful engine and transmission for the tank, but due to a lack of time, those improvements could not be added. One major improvement was to place the fuel tank in the back of the tank, rather than in the front, so the fuel would not catch fire when the tank was hit. They also added more armor because the Germans were developing anti-tank weapons. The Mark I had long-barreled guns, but those were shortened on the Mark IV because they often got wedged into the ground when attempting to cross a ditch. Production for the Mark IV began in May 1917. After the Germans saw the British tanks in action for the first time in September 1916, they realized they needed to create a new tank model of their own, as well as new weapons to fight the British tanks. Joseph Vollmer, one of Germany's first car designers, was placed in charge of designing the A7V. The design had a rectangular armored superstructure and used modified track components from a Holt tractor. The A7V was the first German tank to enter production, which it did in October 1917. Beginning with the Mark IV, the tank could barely reach 4 miles per hour, and on the rough terrain in a lot of places on the Western Front, the Mark IV only reached sluggish speeds of 3 miles per hour. Placed in the middle of the tank was its engine. It used the same engine as the Mark I, which was an old tractor engine. It was the Daimler-Foster 6-cylinder petrol engine of 105 horsepower, which had the job of pushing the 28-ton beast forwards. The Mark IV could cross trenches over 8 feet wide, but to help with crossing these trenches, and even some wider trenches, the Mark IVs often carried fascine, a large bundle of sticks on the roof of their tanks, to dump into the enemy trenches to help cross it. In order to transport the Mark IVs, they were placed on trains and shipped to the front. In order to make the transport easier, the sponsons, the blocks on the side of the tank where the guns were placed, could be pushed inside of the tank for transport. The Mark IV had two 42-gallon fuel tanks placed in the back of the tank in an armored container. With 84 gallons of fuel, the tank could go about 15 to 20 miles on flat ground. However, bad terrain significantly reduced the range of the tank, which made it difficult to predict how far the tank could go. The A-7V does not have a good reputation. It had poor trench crossing capabilities and often fell over when crossing ditches due to its high center of gravity. Hooks were placed at the front of the tank so it could be towed out if it got stuck in soft terrain or a ditch. The Germans did not design as good of a tank as the British for a battlefield with ditches and trenches, and the A-7V could only climb over an obstacle 1¼ feet tall. The A-7V was much faster than the British design, moving at 8 miles per hour on flat terrain and 4 miles per hour cross-country. It was powered by two engines side by side in the middle of the tank, and each engine produced 100 horsepower, nearly double the power compared to the Mark IV. The A-7V had a similar weight to the Mark IV, with it weighing in at 30 tons. Because of their weight, both tanks could easily sink and get stuck in soft terrain. The engines used in these early heavy tanks were incredibly underpowered, as the horsepower per ton for the A-7V was 6.6 horsepower. It was even worse for the Mark IV, which had 3.4 horsepower per ton. The Mark IV was made for crossing ditches and trenches, but it just didn't look the same for the A-7V. However, when the A-7V was on flat terrain, it performed very well, as it was fast and maneuverable. The A-7V had 132 gallons of fuel, but like the Mark IV, its range of 20 to 50 miles was determined by the terrain it was crossing. There were two types of Mark IV tanks, the male tank and the female tank. The male tank was armed with one 57mm gun in each sponson, which could easily take out an A-7V or be fired at a pillbox. One drawback of the Mark IV's guns was that they had limited side-to-side transversal. Next, there were a couple of different shells the tank could fire. The Mark IV had an armored piercing shell to take out heavily armored targets. They also had a high explosive shell that could not pierce enemy armor, but would explode and send fragments around it, damaging enemy soldiers. Another shell that they used is the canister shell, which was like shooting a giant shotgun. Along with the 57mm guns on the side of the tank, one 7.7mm machine gun was placed on the side of each sponson, and there was also one more machine gun mounted at the front of the tank. If necessary, they had a spare machine gun to replace one of the other machine guns. As for the female Mark IV tanks, they were not to be used to take on heavy targets like the male tank, but rather infantry, as it was armed with 5 machine guns. At first, the machine guns used in the tanks were Lewis guns, but then they switched to Hotchkiss machine guns because the Lewis gun had a tendency to overheat. The Hotchkiss was unpopular at first because they only used 14-round magazines, but they were later upgraded to have a 50-round magazine. The female tanks were preferred because machine guns were excellent at clearing the battlefield from enemy soldiers, and heavy German targets were not as common. The A-7V was produced with a 57mm gun at the front of the tank, which had a slightly slower rate of fire than the British gun. But just like the Mark IV, the A-7V fired armored piercing rounds, high explosive rounds, or canister rounds. There were 6 7.92mm MG08 machine guns in total, 2 on each side and 2 on the back. This means the A-7V could effectively take out enemy infantry on the side of the tank or the back with the machine guns, but because no machine guns were fitted on the front of the tank, the infantry in front would be harder to eliminate. The MG08 used a 250-round belt for ammunition and could fire for much longer than the Hotchkiss machine gun before reloading, but had a slower rate of fire than the Hotchkiss. When it comes to armor, the A7V held a clear advantage over the Mark IV. In the front of the tank, the A7V used 30mm of hardened steel as armor, as much as some of the versions of the Panzer III. On the sides and back, the A7V had 15mm of armor. For its day, the A7V was like a moving fortress with its guns and armor. Another advantage of the A7V's armor was that it was slightly sloped, making it easier for the incoming projectiles to bounce off. The Mark IV had much less armor than the A7V, at 12mm, or about half an inch, of armor on the front. It had 8mm on the sides and 6mm on the back. Since the standard German rifle could not pierce the Mark IV's armor, the Germans aimed field guns at them and developed anti-tank rifles. However, bullets from German rifles could still damage the Mark IVs. The Mark IV had a few different firing ports in the hull, which were small openings in the tank the crew could open up in order to shoot their pistol at an enemy that was on the roof of the tank or below them in a trench. When a bullet impacted the armor of the tank, it fragmented, sending tiny bits of metal around where the bullet impacted. This bullet splash could find its way inside the tank through a firing port, a vision port, or in between the riveted metal. As you'd expect, these conditions in the World War I tanks were not the best. For the Mark IV, you were with 7 other crew members. There was a driver, a commander, 2 gunners, 2 loaders, and 2 men working the gearbox. The driver and commander, who sat at the front of the tank, could not see to the side of the tank because the tracks extended past their viewpoints. When in a battle, the driver and commander used periscopes to see the battlefield, rather than an open vision port. The engine was placed in the middle of the tank, so all you would hear was this awful roar of the engine. Many crew members riding in a Mark IV, or any other early tank, would often get carbon monoxide poisoning. The engine was so loud that in order to communicate with the crew, the commander had to use hand signals. To coordinate a turn for the Mark IV, 4 people were needed: the commander to direct them, the 2 men working the gearbox, and the driver. Lack of suspension on the Mark IV meant that the crew could be thrown around when crossing through rough terrain. On the other hand, the A7V had a suspension system similar to a Holt tractor design. If the tank was traveling over rough terrain, the crew could grab ropes that were fitted over their heads to stabilize themselves. Just like in the Mark IV, the 2 engines in the A7V were very loud and the crew could get sick with carbon monoxide poisoning. Both tanks could easily exceed 100 degrees in temperature, and the crews often had to operate for the tank for 7 to 8 hours straight. In summer, the temperature in the tank could get far worse. As for the crew, the tank often used 18 men, and sometimes as many as 22. Although the A7V was more spacious than the Mark IV, there were at least 10 more men in the German tank than the British one. Some could easily get claustrophobic in these tight conditions. They had a loader and a gunner for the 57mm gun, a loader and a gunner for each of the 6 machine guns, a commander and a driver, and a few mechanics. Sometimes, a soldier or 2 would get in the tank to be transported. The commander and the driver sat at the top of the tank, and they had an excellent view of the battlefield, better than the Mark IV. The A7V used an advanced aiming and communication system for its day. The commander could relay a message to each of the crew stations by sending a signal which lit up a message above each position. And to help alleviate with the toxic fumes and heat, ventilators were installed in the ceiling. World War I saw the beginning of tank designs, and the designers were still working to solve the many flaws of these early tanks, and many of the designs were not fully competent. The A7V was prone to breakdowns, more so than the Allied tank designs, hence the mechanics riding in the tank. The Mark IV had problems with breaking down as well. For example, on November 20th, 1917, at the beginning of the Battle of Cambrai, around 432 Mark IVs were used. Of the 179 lost, 2/3 of them broke down or got stuck in the terrain. When crossing a ditch, the A-7V often got stuck because the nose of the tank overhung the tracks. However, there were other parts of the Western Front that were not covered with craters and trenches, where the A-7V performed much better. Finally, the A-7V often fell over when crossing uneven ground because of its high center of gravity. The German army had ordered 100 A-7V tanks to be produced by the end of 1917, but in reality, only 20 tanks were made throughout the remaining time of the war. Production was proven more difficult because there was a resource shortage in Germany because of the blockade of Germany implemented by the British, and U-boats were made a higher priority than the tanks, so they got most of the materials first. Allied tank production was far more impressive, as the British were able to create 1,220 Mark IV tanks by the end of the war. There were 420 male tanks, 595 female tanks, and 205 unarmed tanks used to carry supplies. The Mark IV was good at crossing through the rough terrain found on a World War I battlefield, and while the A-7V didn't perform as well on rough terrain, it was excellent at moving across flat terrain found on other parts of the front. The Mark IV had more firepower than the A-7V, with its two 57mm guns, and the A-7V had many machine guns and could fire out of all of its sides. Both tanks had unpleasant crew conditions and many reliability issues, but they paved the way for better tank models and changed the ways wars would be fought.